Doctor humiliates black nurse in front of patient, unaware of who the patient really is. The code blue alarm pierced through St. Mary's Hospital as Angela Parker raced down the pristine corridor. "Don't let her touch him," Dr. Greaves's voice thundered across the emergency room. But Angela had already seen it, the patient's oxygen levels plummeting, the subtle signs others had missed. Without hesitation, she pushed past the prejudiced doctor and performed the life-saving procedure. In the corner, an elderly patient watched silently from his wheelchair, his sharp eyes taking in every detail of the unfolding drama. None of them knew then, but this moment would shatter St. Mary's prestigious facade, exposing decades of buried secrets and setting in motion a chain of events that would test the very limits of human compassion, prejudice, and redemption. In those crucial seconds, as Angela fought to save the patient's life, she couldn't have known that her own daughter lay in a hospital bed just 3 floors above, her condition worsening with each passing hour. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. St. Mary's General Hospital stood like a gleaming fortress in the affluent suburbs, its pristine white walls and manicured gardens masking a darker legacy that stretched back generations. For 30 years, it had been the crown jewel of the city's healthcare system, serving the elite while maintaining a carefully cultivated image of excellence and sophistication. Angela Parker knew this history all too well. 20 years ago, her mother, Sarah Parker, had walked these same halls as a nurse, until a fatal incident involving a wealthy patient ended her career. They had blamed her mother's incompetence. But 8-year-old Angela had seen her mother's tears, heard the whispered slurs, and witnessed how quickly the hospital had closed ranks against one of their own. Now, at 32, Angela stood at the same nurse's station where her mother had once worked, her credentials impeccable, her determination unwavering. But she carried 2 burdens that threatened to crush her spirit. Her mother, now confined to a wheelchair after years of untreated depression had led to a stroke, and her 12-year-old daughter Emily, fighting a rare blood disorder in room 412 of this very hospital. Nurse Parker, a cold voice cut through her thoughts. Dr. William Greaves, chief of surgery, approached with his usual air of barely concealed disdain. His steel-gray hair and perfectly pressed white coat projected authority, but it was his eyes that told the true story, cold, calculating, and filled with prejudice carefully hidden behind professional courtesy. "Your daughter's latest test results," he said, holding out a file without quite meeting her gaze. "I trust you understand what they mean." The implied message was clear. Emily's condition was worsening, and Angela's position at St. Mary's wouldn't guarantee any special treatment. The hospital staff moved around them like a choreographed dance, white coats and scrubs creating a sea of uniformity that somehow always made Angela feel more conspicuous. Nurses who had welcomed others with warm smiles offered her only curt nods. Doctors who eagerly mentored new staff members seemed to look through her as if she were invisible. In the break room, conversations would stop when she entered, resuming in whispers once she left. "Can you believe they hired her? It's all about quotas these days. Just wait until something goes wrong." The words were never spoken directly to her, but they hung in the air like a toxic cloud. But Angela had inherited her mother's strength and her father's determination. Before his death in the line of duty as a firefighter, he had taught her that true courage meant standing tall, even when the world tried to push you down. That lesson had carried her through medical school, where she graduated top of her class despite professors who suggested she might be more comfortable in a less demanding field. Emily's diagnosis had nearly broken her. The same rare blood disorder that had taken her father's life now threatened her daughter. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Angela. The hospital that had destroyed her mother's career was now her only hope for saving her child. She had taken the position at St. Mary's not just to prove her worth, but because it had the best pediatric hematology department in the state. Dr. Greaves's reputation preceded him: brilliant surgeon, respected researcher, and according to hospital whispers, a man who had quietly ensured that certain staff members never advanced beyond their natural station. His own tragic past, losing his son in a medical incident years ago, had hardened rather than softened him, turning his grief into a rigid adherence to hierarchy and tradition. The hospital board, a collection of the city's elite, praised his leadership while turning a blind eye to the subtle ways he maintained what he called standards under his influence. St. Mary's had remained a bastion of old money and older prejudices, even as the world beyond its walls changed. As Angela watched Dr. Greaves disappear down the corridor, she clutched Emily's file to her chest. In room 412, her daughter waited, brave and smiling despite the pain, unaware of the battles her mother fought every day just to ensure she received proper care. The weight of being both mother and nurse, professional and parent, crusader and caregiver, pressed down on Angela's shoulders like a heavy crown. But today felt different. Perhaps it was the way the morning light struck the hospital windows, or the unusual quiet in the halls, or the arrival of a new patient in room 415, an elderly man whose keen eyes seemed to see everything. Something in the air suggested change was coming to St. Mary's, whether Dr. Greaves and his allies were ready for it or not. The morning started with a code blue that would change everything. Angela raced to room 301, her heart pounding not just from the sprint, but from seeing Dr. Greaves already there, his face twisted in a familiar expression of disapproval. The patient was coding, and Angela immediately spotted what others had missed: signs of a severe allergic reaction to the newly administered medication. "He needs epinephrine now," Angela called out, reaching for the crash cart. "Step back. Nurse Parker," Dr. Greaves commanded, his voice sharp. "I'll handle this." But Angela could see the patient's oxygen levels plummeting. Every second counted. In that moment, she made a choice that would set everything in motion. Against direct order, she administered the epinephrine. Within moments, the patient stabilized. Dr. Greaves's face turned purple with rage. "My office." Now the words came through clenched teeth. Before she could follow him, her phone buzzed a message from Emily's nurse. Her daughter's fever had spiked again. Angela's world tilted on its axis, but she forced herself to remain professional, even as her heart screamed to run to her child. In Dr. Greaves's office, the confrontation was immediate. "You undermine my authority," he seethed. "This is exactly why your kind doesn't belong here. Your mother never learned her place either." The mention of her mother sparked something in Angela. "My kind, Dr. Greaves? You mean nurses who save patients' lives? Or are you referring to something else?" "Watch yourself, Nurse Parker. Your daughter's receiving treatment here, isn't she? It would be a shame if there were complications with her care." The threat, thinly veiled but clear, made Angela's blood run cold. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. A nurse entered, looking flustered. "Dr. Greaves, Mr. Edwards in 415 is requesting to speak with you. He's quite insistent." Thomas Edwards, the new patient who had been admitted yesterday after a skiing accident. Something about his name tugged at Angela's memory, but she couldn't place it. "We're not finished," Dr. Greaves warned before sweeping out of the office. Angela took a moment to steady herself before heading to Emily's room. Her daughter lay pale against the white sheets, dark circles under her eyes, but still managing a weak smile. "Mom, you look worried." "Just busy," baby Angela checked Emily's vitals, her professional calm warring with maternal panic. The numbers weren't good. A shadow appeared in the doorway, the patient from 415, Thomas Edwards, leaning on a walker. His eyes, sharp despite his apparent frailty, took in the scene. "Quite a show in 301 earlier," he commented quietly. "Quick thinking with that epinephrine." Angela turned, surprised. "Sir, you shouldn't be walking around." Perhaps not. His smile was knowing. But sometimes we have to break rules to do what's right, don't we, Nurse Parker? There was something about the way he said her name, something that made her think he knew more than he was letting on. Before she could respond, monitors started blaring. Emily's blood pressure was dropping rapidly. As Angela hit the call button, she heard Mr. Edwards speaking quietly into a phone. "Yes, I've seen enough. Start the process immediately." The day had begun with one crisis, but Angela didn't know it was just the beginning. Between her daughter's worsening condition, Dr. Greaves's threats, and the mysterious Mr. Edwards, forces were aligning that would tear St. Mary's carefully constructed facade apart, and Angela was standing at the center of the storm. The operating room buzzed with tension as Dr. Greaves prepared for the high-stakes surgery. Board members and hospital administrators watched from the observation deck above a rare occurrence that had everyone on edge. Angela stood at her assigned position, acutely aware of the weight of their stares. "Nurse Parker," Dr. Greaves announced, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. "Since you're so fond of making critical decisions, you'll assist directly today." The patient, a prominent local judge, lay unconscious on the table. Angela recognized the setup for what it was, a public test designed to humiliate her. But her focus remained on the patient's vitals, which she monitored with practiced precision. As the surgery progressed, Angela noticed something concerning in the patient's readings. Dr. Greaves was preparing to make an incision that, given the unexpected complications she observed, could prove catastrophic. She glanced at the observation deck, where Thomas Edwards sat in his wheelchair, his eyes fixed intently on the scene below. Dr. Greaves, Angela spoke clearly, the patient's coagulation levels. "Nurse Parker, your job is to assist, not advise," he cut her off sharply. But Angela persisted. "Sir, with respect, if you proceed with that incision, the patient could bleed out. His levels aren't what we expected." The room fell silent. Dr. Greaves's hands froze mid-motion. Above, the observers leaned forward. "How dare you question?" Dr. Greaves began, but the patient's monitor suddenly confirmed Angela's warning. The numbers didn't lie. In that moment, a nurse burst into the OR. "Dr. Greaves, I have urgent information about the patient's updated blood work." The results only confirmed what Angela had already spotted. Dr. Greaves was forced to adjust his approach, his face rigid with suppressed fury. The surgery proceeded successfully, but the damage to his ego was done. As they scrubbed out, Angela found a manila envelope in her locker. Inside were hospital records from 20 years ago, the case that had ended her mother's career. But these documents told a different story than the official version. They showed evidence of tampering, of deliberate misrepresentation, and at the bottom of each altered report was a familiar signature, Dr. William Greaves. Her hands trembling, Angela nearly missed the note tucked into the envelope. "There's more. Meet me in the hospital chapel at midnight, M." But before she could process this revelation, her phone buzzed. Emily's condition had taken another turn for the worse. Racing to her daughter's room, Angela found Dr. Greaves already there, reviewing Emily's chart with an unsettling smile. "Interesting case," he mused, not looking up. "Such a rare condition. Requires very specific care. It would be tragic if there were any mistakes." The threat hung in the air between them. Angela thought of the documents in her locker, of her mother's ruined career, of the patient whose life she'd just saved. "Are you threatening my daughter, Dr. Greaves?" He finally met her gaze. "I'm simply stating facts. Medicine is complicated. Things go wrong, especially when staff members don't understand their place in the hierarchy. Like my mother didn't understand her place." His eyes narrowed. "Your mother made her choices, as you're making yours." From the doorway came a quiet voice. Fascinating conversation. Thomas Edwards wheeled himself into the room. The board would be very interested in hearing it in full. Dr. Greaves straightened. "Mr. Edwards, this is a private." "Nothing in this hospital is private anymore, Doctor. Not after what I've seen. Not after what's in those records." Angela looked between them, sensing currents of power and knowledge she didn't yet understand. But before anyone could speak further, Emily's monitors began to wail. Her daughter's eyes rolled back, her body convulsing. "She's crashing," Angela cried out, maternal fear overwhelming professional distance. In that crucial moment, Dr. Greaves had to make a choice: maintain his power play or save a child's life. His hesitation lasted only a second, but Thomas Edwards saw it. They all saw it. The next few minutes were a blur of activity, of life-saving measures and professional expertise overriding personal animosity. Emily stabilized, but the landscape of power in St. Mary's had shifted irreversibly. Something had broken in that room, not just Dr. Greaves's facade of authority, but the entire system of silence and compliance that had protected him for so long. Emily's condition continued to deteriorate over the next few days, each setback driving a deeper wedge of fear into Angela's heart. The rare blood disorder was advancing more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, and the specialized treatment she needed seemed perpetually delayed by administrative issues that Angela knew bore Dr. Greaves's signature. Late one evening, as Angela sat by her daughter's bedside reviewing the mysterious documents from her locker, a soft knock drew her attention. Martha Greaves, the doctor's wife, stood in the doorway, her elegant appearance at odds with the hospital's sterile environment. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. When Angela nodded, Martha closed the door behind her and approached Emily's bed. "She looks so much like my Michael did." "Your Michael?" Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Our son, he died 15 years ago. A rare blood disorder, the same one your Emily has." The revelation hit Angela like a physical blow. I didn't know. "William never talks about it. He changed after Michael died. The bitterness, the anger, it consumed him. But seeing your daughter, watching you fight for her, it's bringing everything back." Before Martha could continue, voices in the hallway made her stiffen. She quickly pressed a key card into Angela's hand. "Records room. Tonight. There's something you need to see." Throughout her shift, Angela's mind raced with possibilities. The weight of the key card in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Meanwhile, support for her began to build from unexpected quarters. Younger nurses, inspired by her stand in the operating room, started speaking up about their own experiences of discrimination. Patients who had witnessed Dr. Greaves's behavior shared their stories. Thomas Edwards, still officially a patient but clearly much more, watched it all unfold from his strategic position in room 415. His quiet presence seemed to encourage others to speak up, though few could say exactly why. That night, in the dimly lit records room, Angela discovered the full extent of St. Mary's dark history. Hidden away in dusty files were decades of covered-up incidents, discriminatory practices, and lives destroyed by prejudice. But most shocking was a file labeled Michael Greaves. The truth struck her like lightning. Dr. Greaves's son hadn't just died from a blood disorder, he had died because the hospital's discriminatory practices had delayed his treatment. The doctor in charge had been Martha's brother, a prominent physician who had insisted on following traditional protocols despite the urgent need for experimental treatment. The loss had broken something in William Greaves. Instead of fighting against the system that had failed his son, he had become its most ardent defender, as if rigid adherence to hierarchy and tradition could prevent future tragedies. His particular hostility toward Angela stemmed from a terrible irony. Her father had been the nurse who had tried to intervene in Michael's case, who had seen the need for immediate action, just as Angela had done in recent surgeries. As Angela processed this information, her phone buzzed. Emily's fever was spiking again. Racing back to her daughter's room, she found Dr. Greaves already there, his face ashen as he reviewed the charts. "The treatment isn't working," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hollow. "She needs the experimental protocol. The same one that could have saved Michael." His head snapped up, eyes wide with shock and recognition. For a moment, the mask of authority cracked, revealing the grieving father beneath. "How did you?" "Your wife told me, and I found the files." Angela stepped closer. "Dr. Greaves, I understand your pain, but are you really going to let another child die because of this broken system?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with history and possibility. Outside the room, hospital staff gathered, drawn by the tension radiating from within. Thomas Edwards wheeled himself to the doorway, watching intently. "The board won't approve it," Dr. Greaves said finally. "The protocols, the paperwork." "Actually," Thomas Edwards interrupted, "the board will approve it immediately, along with a full investigation into every case where treatment was delayed or denied based on discriminatory practices." Dr. Greaves turned sharply. "You can't. I can, and I will. The question is, Doctor, which side of history do you want to be on this time?" The moment stretched, filled with the beeping of Emily's monitors and the weight of decades of pain and prejudice. Finally, Dr. Greaves reached for his phone. "Get me the experimental protocol paperwork," he ordered, "and get me the files on Sarah Parker's case from 20 years ago. It's time we corrected some mistakes." As the night shift began, word spread through St. Mary's halls that something fundamental had shifted. The hospital's carefully maintained facade had cracked, revealing the possibility of real change. But for Angela, watching her daughter's monitors and holding her small hand, the battle was far from over. Emily's life hung in the balance, and the forces of resistance within St. Mary's wouldn't go down without a fight. In room 415, Thomas Edwards made another quiet phone call, setting in motion events that would shake the hospital to its very foundations. The next 24 hours would test everyone's convictions, reveal long-buried truths, and force each person to decide what they truly stood for. The emergency sirens wailed through St. Mary's halls as two critical cases arrived simultaneously. A bus accident had left multiple victims in need of immediate surgery, and among them was a young African-American girl whose injuries mirrored Emily's condition, complicating any potential treatment. Dr. Greaves stood in the emergency room, his face tight with tension. "We only have enough of the experimental treatment for one patient right now," he announced, his eyes moving between Emily's room and the trauma bay where the accident victim lay. "The next shipment won't arrive for 48 hours. Angela felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She looked at the young girl, then thought of Emily upstairs. Both children needed the treatment to survive the next 24 hours. Dr. Greaves, one of the senior nurses, spoke up. "Protocol dictates we prioritize accident victims over existing patients." The old Dr. Greaves would have immediately enforced this protocol, but now he hesitated, the weight of his own past decisions heavy in the air. "Nurse Parker," he said finally, "what would you do?" The entire emergency room fell silent. Every eye turned to Angela, who stood frozen between her duties as a nurse and her instincts as a mother. The young girl's parents huddled nearby, their faces etched with the same fear Angela had carried for months. "Save her," Angela said, her voice breaking. "Emily would want that." Before anyone could react, Martha Greaves burst into the ER. "William," she called out, clutching a file. "I found it Michael's original case file. The treatment. There might be a way to synthesize enough for both children." Dr. Greaves's face paled. "That procedure was experimental. Dangerous. It's why we didn't try it with Michael." "But you're a better doctor now," Martha insisted. "And you have help." She looked meaningfully at Angela. "The procedure would require perfect coordination between surgeon and nurse, with zero margin for error. One mistake could cost both children their lives." "I can't," Dr. Greaves whispered. "Not after Michael." Angela stepped forward. "Dr. Greaves, 20 years ago my mother tried to save a patient by suggesting an unconventional treatment. You shut her down. Today you have a chance to make a different choice." Thomas Edwards wheeled himself into the chaos, his presence commanding attention. Sometimes, he said quietly, the greatest medical breakthroughs come from moments of crisis. The monitors in both rooms began beeping urgently. They were out of time. Dr. Greaves straightened, years of grief and prejudice warring with his physician's oath. "Prep both patients," he ordered. "Nurse Parker, with me. The rest of you, pray we don't make the same mistakes I made 15 years ago." The next hours were a blur of intense concentration. Dr. Greaves and Angela worked in perfect synchronization, their past antagonism forgotten in the desperate race to save 2 young lives. Martha Greaves and Thomas Edwards watched from the observation deck, along with several board members who had been summoned by the unfolding drama. Halfway through the procedure, Emily's vitals began to crash. Angela's hands trembled for just a moment. "Stay with me. Nurse Parker," Dr. Greaves's voice cut through her panic. "I lost my son because I was too afraid to take a chance. I won't lose these children because of fear." The procedure continued, each moment balanced on a knife's edge. In the observation deck, Thomas Edwards made a series of urgent phone calls, his voice low but intense. Finally, after what seemed like hours, both girls were stabilized. The experimental treatment had worked, synthesized and administered against all odds. As the adrenaline faded, Angela felt her knees buckle. Dr. Greaves caught her arm, supporting her. For the first time, they looked at each other not as adversaries, but as 2 people who had faced their deepest fears and emerged stronger. But their victory was short-lived. Hospital administration representatives entered the recovery room, their faces grave. Dr. Greaves, Nurse Parker, the lead administrator, announced, "The board has called an emergency meeting. Your unauthorized procedure, while successful, has raised serious concerns about protocol violations." As they were led away, Angela caught a glimpse of Thomas Edwards speaking intensely with Martha Greaves. Something was happening behind the scenes, forces moving that she couldn't yet see. What had started as a medical emergency had become a pivotal moment in St. Mary's history. The next few hours would determine not just Angela and Dr. Greaves's futures, but the very soul of the institution itself. The hospital chapel stood silent in the pre-dawn hours, its stained glass windows casting multicolored shadows across the empty pews. Angela knelt in prayer, her scrub still stained from the emergency procedures, her heart heavy with both hope and fear. Emily was stable, but far from safe. "I thought I'd find you here," Martha Greaves's voice echoed softly through the chapel. "William used to come here every night after Michael died. Sometimes I think he was more angry at God than at the system that failed our son." Angela opened her eyes but remained kneeling. "My mother always said that faith isn't about getting what we pray for, it's about finding strength when we don't." Martha sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The board is deliberating now. They're talking about revoking both your license and William's. The old guard, they're calling it reckless endangerment despite the fact that you saved those children." The chapel doors creaked open again. Dr. Greaves entered, looking older than Angela had ever seen him. His usual commanding presence had crumbled, replaced by the bearing of a man confronting his past sins. "The little girl from the accident," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Her name is Michelle. She's the same age Michael was." He walked slowly to the altar, staring up at the cross. "All these years I thought I was honoring his memory by maintaining order, by enforcing the rules that I blamed for his death. Instead, I became the very thing that killed him." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of monitors and the soft whispers of prayer from the hospital corridors. In this sacred space, the carefully constructed barriers between them began to crumble. My father used to say that God doesn't give us more than we can handle. Angela spoke softly. But sometimes I think he gives us exactly what we need to handle to become who we're meant to be. Dr. Greaves turned, tears streaming down his face. I saw Michael in them, both in Emily and Michelle. When their vitals crashed, I heard his monitors flatline. But this time I had a choice. This time I could be brave enough to try. Martha moved to her husband's side, taking his hand. William, tell her about the letter. With trembling hands, Dr. Greaves withdrew an aged envelope from his pocket. This arrived the day after Michael died. Your father wrote it, Angela. He was the nurse who fought to try the experimental treatment. He knew it might have saved Michael. Angela stood, her legs unsteady. Her father, the man who had taught her to stand tall in the face of prejudice, had tried to save Dr. Greaves' son. The symmetry of it all, Emily, Michelle, Michael felt like more than coincidence. Thomas Edwards wheeled himself into the chapel, his presence somehow fitting in this moment of revelation. Sometimes, he said quietly, God's grace works through our greatest trials. Before anyone could respond, a young nurse burst into the chapel. Emily's crashing, she gasped. And Michelle too, the treatment. Something's wrong. The peaceful sanctuary erupted into motion. As they raced through the corridors, Angela's mother's words echoed in her mind. Faith isn't just about believing in miracles, it's about being strong enough to keep going when they don't come. In Emily's room, the monitors screamed their warning. Beside her, Michelle's vitals were failing in an eerily similar pattern. Dr. Greaves stood frozen, the ghost of his son's death paralyzing him. William, Angela called, her voice cutting through his fear. God didn't bring us here to lose them. Not this time. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment something profound passed between them: understanding, forgiveness, and a shared determination to not let history repeat itself. As dawn broke over St. Mary's, its light streaming through the hospital windows like a divine blessing, they fought together to save the children that fate, or perhaps something greater, had brought into their care. The chapel below stood empty but watchful, its silent witness to their struggles a reminder that sometimes healing comes not just to bodies but to souls as well. The hospital boardroom fell into stunned silence as Thomas Edwards wheeled himself to the head of the table. Gone was the frail patient from room 415. In his place sat the CEO of the nation's largest healthcare consortium, his eyes sharp with purpose. 20 years ago, he began, his voice filling the room, my daughter died in this hospital. Like Michael Greaves, she needed experimental treatment. Like Michael, she was denied not because of medical reasons, but because of who she was, who I was before I built my company. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Greaves, standing by the window, turned slowly, recognition dawning on his face. Edwards. Your daughter was Sarah Edwards. The case that changed our protocols. The case that should have changed them, Thomas corrected. Instead, it was buried. Like so many others, he nodded to his assistant, who distributed thick folders to everyone present. These are the cases we've uncovered. 20 years of systematic discrimination hidden behind policies and protocols. Martha Greaves stepped forward, her elegant composure masking the tremor in her voice. I've been gathering evidence for years, she revealed. After Michael died, I couldn't just watch it continue. Every denied treatment, every delayed procedure, every career destroyed, I documented it all. The revelation hit Dr. Greaves like a physical blow. You knew all this time. I tried to tell you, William, but your grief, it blinded you. You became part of the very system that killed our son. Angela stood silently, watching the scene unfold. The documents in front of her told a story that connected them all: her mother's ruined career, Michael's death, Emily's struggle, and countless others who had suffered under St. Mary's discriminatory practices. There's more, Thomas continued. He pressed a button, and a familiar face appeared on the boardroom screen. Angela's mother, Sarah Parker, sitting in her wheelchair but speaking with clear determination. She had recorded her testimony, finally telling the full story of what had happened 20 years ago. Dr. Greaves sank into a chair, the weight of truth crushing his carefully constructed worldview. All this time, he whispered, I thought I was protecting the hospital's standards. Instead, I was perpetuating its sins. Martha moved to her husband's side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. It's not too late to make it right, William. For Michael. For all of them. The board members began to whisper among themselves, papers rustling as they absorbed the magnitude of the evidence before them. But before any discussion could begin, alarms blared through the hospital speakers. Code Blue Pediatric Wing. Code Blue Pediatric Wing. Angela's heart stopped. Emily's room was in the pediatric wing. She was already running before anyone could react, Dr. Greaves close behind her. Behind them, Thomas Edwards spoke quickly into his phone, setting in motion plans years in the making. The truth had finally come to light, but would it be in time to save those still caught in the system's grip? As Angela raced through the corridor, she realized that the real fight was just beginning. The exposure of St. Mary's dark history was not just about justice for the past, it was about saving lives in the present and changing the future. The scene in the pediatric wing was chaos incarnate. Emily and Michelle's rooms had been merged into a makeshift trauma center, both girls fighting for their lives as their conditions deteriorated in terrifying synchronicity. The experimental treatment that had seemed like salvation hours before was now threatening to overwhelm their systems. Angela and Dr. Greaves burst into the room simultaneously, their recent revelations momentarily forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. The monitors screamed their warnings as nurses scrambled to stabilize both patients. It's the same pattern as Michael, Dr. Greaves whispered, his face ashen, exactly the same. Angela's professional calm warred with maternal panic as she checked Emily's vitals. We're not losing them. Not this time. Thomas Edwards wheeled himself into the crowded room, Martha Greaves close behind him. There's another treatment, he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. It was developed after my daughter's death. Experimental, but... No, Dr. Greaves interrupted. It's too risky. The board would never. The board is being dissolved as we speak, Thomas revealed. Emergency measures are being implemented. The question isn't about permission anymore, William. It's about whether you're willing to take the same risk for these girls that you weren't willing to take for Michael. The words hit Dr. Greaves like a physical blow. He looked at Emily, then at Michelle, seeing his son's face in both of them. 20 years of guilt, fear, and rigid adherence to rules that had failed his own child weighed against the lives hanging in the balance. If we try this and fail, he said quietly, we'll both lose our licenses, everything we've worked for. And if we don't try, Angela responded, her voice steady despite her tears, we lose something far more precious. Outside the room, hospital staff gathered, drawn by the unfolding drama. Among them were nurses and doctors who had witnessed years of discrimination, who had stayed silent out of fear or complicity. Now they watched as two people who had been enemies mere days ago faced an impossible choice together. Martha stepped forward, placing a hand on her husband's arm. William, remember what you said in the chapel. This is your chance to be brave. The monitor's alarms grew more insistent. They were running out of time. The treatment, Thomas said, is being delivered now, but it must be administered by a doctor and nurse working in perfect synchronization. The timing has to be exact. Dr. Greaves looked at Angela, years of prejudice and pride falling away in the face of this crucial moment. Nurse Parker. Angela, I can't do this without you. You don't have to, she replied. What followed was a symphony of medical precision. Dr. Greaves and Angela moved in perfect harmony, their combined expertise focused entirely on saving the two young lives before them. The watching crowd held their collective breath as the delicate procedure unfolded. At the critical moment, both girls' vitals plummeted simultaneously. Angela's hands trembled for just a second before Dr. Greaves' steady voice anchored her. "Stay with me, Angela. Remember your father's courage. Remember my son." Thomas Edwards made one final call, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "The board is officially dissolved. Emergency control of St. Mary's has been transferred to the new Oversight Committee. Whatever happens here, there will be no repercussions except those demanded by medical ethics." The next few minutes stretched like hours. Every person in and around the room seemed to be holding their breath, united in hope and fear. Finally, miraculously, both monitors began to show improvement. Emily's eyes fluttered open first, followed seconds later by Michelle's. The room erupted in tears and relieved laughter. Dr. Greaves sagged against the wall, emotions overwhelming his usual composure. But their victory was immediately tempered by the arrival of hospital security and several official-looking individuals. Dr. William Greaves, Nurse Angela Parker, one announced grimly, "The medical board requires your immediate presence for an emergency hearing." As they were led away from their celebrating colleagues, Angela and Dr. Greaves shared a look of understanding. They had saved the children, but the price might be their careers. Yet somehow in that moment it seemed a small price to pay. Thomas Edwards watched them go, a subtle smile playing at his lips. "Martha," he said quietly, "I believe it's time for phase 2. The transformation of St. Mary's had begun with a confrontation of its past sins. Now, as dawn broke over the hospital, it was about to enter a new era, one built on the courage of those who had dared to put lives above rules and healing above prejudice. The medical board hearing was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. Sarah Parker, Angela's mother, wheeled herself into the room, aided by Martha Greaves. The woman who had been silenced 20 years ago now commanded the attention of everyone present. "Before you make your decision," Sarah announced, her voice strong despite her physical frailty, "there's something you need to know about Thomas Edwards and the night my career ended." The room fell silent as Sarah revealed the truth that had been buried for 2 decades. "The patient I tried to save that night wasn't just any patient. She was Mary Edwards, Thomas's wife and the mother of his daughter Sarah. I recognized the same symptoms that had taken my husband, the same condition that now threatens my granddaughter." Thomas Edwards wheeled forward, tears in his eyes. "I wasn't always the CEO of a healthcare empire. 20 years ago, I was a janitor at this hospital working nights to support my family. When my wife and daughter fell ill, the system saw us as expendable. Sarah Parker was the only one who fought for them." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Dr. Greaves staggered slightly, remembering how he had supported the decision to dismiss Sarah Parker, how he had helped maintain the very system that would later claim his own son. "After I lost them," Thomas continued, "I dedicated my life to building the power needed to change things. I bought companies, merged hospitals, gained influence. But I never forgot the nurse who risked everything trying to save my family." Martha Greaves stepped forward, producing another file. "There's more. William, the protocol that Sarah Parker suggested that night, it was the same one that could have saved Michael. The one you rejected years later because you had become so committed to maintaining the system that destroyed your son." Dr. Greaves collapsed into a chair, the weight of 2 decades of mistakes crushing him. "I became the very thing that killed my son," he whispered. Angela stood by her mother's wheelchair, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. The mysterious documents, the timing of Thomas Edwards' arrival, Martha's secret support, it had all been part of a plan years in the making. "The real question," Thomas addressed the medical board, "isn't whether Dr. Greaves and Nurse Parker violated protocols. It's why those protocols exist in the first place. How many lives have been lost to maintain a system built on prejudice and fear?" Sarah Parker took her daughter's hand. 20 years ago, I lost my career trying to save a life. Today, my daughter and the man who helped destroy my career saved 2 children by taking the same risk. If that's worthy of punishment, then perhaps it's not just the protocols that need to change. From the back of the room came another voice, Michelle's father. My daughter is alive because these two people chose to see her as a child worth saving, not a protocol to be followed. If you take their licenses, you'll have to explain to every parent in this community why following rules is more important than saving lives. The medical board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. The story was already spreading through social media, picked up by local news. Outside the hospital, a crowd had gathered, patients, families, staff members, all waiting to learn the fate of the doctor and nurse who had dared to put healing above hierarchy. Thomas Edwards made one final announcement. As of this morning, I have acquired controlling interest in St. Mary's Hospital. The first act of the new board will be to establish the Michael Greaves Memorial Fund, dedicated to ensuring that no child is ever denied treatment because of who they are or where they come from. He turned to Dr. Greaves and Angela. The question isn't whether you'll keep your licenses. The question is whether you're willing to help lead St. Mary's into a new era, one that honors the memories of all those we lost by ensuring we never lose another life to prejudice and protocol. The room erupted in applause. Outside, the crowd began to cheer as the news spread. 20 years of buried truths had finally come to light, connecting four families: the Parkers, the Greaves, the Edwards, and now Michelle's family, in a circle of loss, redemption, and hope. But for Angela, watching her mother smile through tears of vindication, the most powerful revelation was yet to come. Sometimes the greatest healing happens not in operating rooms or through medical procedures, but in the moments when long-buried truths finally rise to light. 5 years after the events that transformed St. Mary's Hospital, the autumn sunlight streamed through new windows that bore the names of those who had been lost to the old system. The Michael Greaves Memorial Wing stood alongside the Sarah Edwards Children's Center, their very existence a testament to how much had changed. Emily Parker, now a healthy teenager, walked the hospital corridors with confidence, her volunteer badge matching her mother's professional one. She paused at the wall of photographs near the entrance faces of those who had been denied care in the past, now serving as a permanent reminder of why the changes had been necessary. Ready for rounds? Angela asked, approaching her daughter with a smile. Now serving as chief of nursing, she had helped implement sweeping changes throughout the hospital system. But her proudest achievement wasn't a policy or a program, it was the sight of her daughter, healthy and determined to follow in her footsteps. Dr. William Greaves, his hair now fully gray but his eyes warmer than they'd ever been, joined them at the wall. He stopped daily at these photographs, a ritual of remembrance and redemption. Your mother would be proud, he said to Angela, nodding toward where Sarah Parker's story was prominently displayed. She started all this, really. Sarah had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, but not before seeing her daughter rise to help lead the hospital she'd once been forced to leave. Her last words had been about forgiveness and the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. Martha Greaves appeared elegant as ever, but now serving as the hospital's patient advocate, ensuring that no voice went unheard, no concern dismissed. The new residents are arriving, she announced. Thomas wants us all there for the orientation. They made their way to the auditorium where Thomas Edwards, still commanding respect from his wheelchair, waited to address the incoming class of medical professionals. The audience included faces of every color and background, a visible sign of the hospital's commitment to diversity. 25 years ago, Thomas began, this hospital lost its way. We confused protocols with principles, rules with righteousness. The price was paid in lives: my wife and daughter, Michael Greaves, and countless others whose stories were buried in files and forgotten. He gestured to Dr. Greaves and Angela. But 5 years ago, two people who should have been enemies chose to become healers instead. They showed us that true medicine isn't about maintaining systems, it's about saving lives. Michelle, now studying pre-med and volunteering in the pediatric ward, sat in the front row, her presence a living testament to their success. Her father had become a member of the hospital's community advisory board, helping ensure that every voice was heard. Today, Thomas continued, St. Mary's stands as a model for healthcare reform across the nation. We've proven that compassion and competence aren't mutually exclusive, that diversity strengthens us, and that the best protocols are those that put patients first. After the orientation, Angela found herself in the old chapel, now an interfaith meditation space. The stained glass windows had been joined by symbols of various faiths, reflecting the hospital's commitment to serving all communities. Dr. Greaves found her there, both of them remembering that night 5 years ago when they had prayed for Emily and Michelle. Sometimes he said quietly, "Our greatest mistakes lead us to our greatest purpose." Outside, the hospital grounds had been transformed into healing gardens, each section dedicated to someone who had been lost. In the center stood a simple fountain with words that captured the spirit of the new saint. Mary's in remembrance of those we lost, in service to those we can save. Emily and Michelle often studied there, their friendship a symbol of the bridges that had been built. They represented the future, a generation that would never know the barriers and prejudices that had once defined healthcare. As the day ended, Angela stood at her office window, watching the sunset paint the hospital in golden light. On her desk sat a photo of her mother, smiling proudly at her nursing school graduation. Beside it was a newer picture, Emily receiving her volunteer award, flanked by Angela and Dr. Greaves. The hospital intercom echoed with a familiar call code blue, but now, when Angela rushed to respond, she knew that every patient would receive the same urgent care, regardless of who they were or where they came from. That was Sarah Parker's true legacy, a hospital where healing knew no boundaries. As she hurried down the corridor, Angela caught her reflection in a window. She saw not just herself, but the shadows of all those who had fought for change: her mother, Michael Greaves, the Edwards family, and countless others whose stories had finally been told. Their sacrifices had transformed St. Mary's from a symbol of discrimination into a beacon of hope. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility, as a new generation prepared to carry forward the lesson that had been learned at such great cost, that true healing begins with the heart. Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones we can see. They're the scars left by prejudice, the pain of being deemed unworthy, and the silent suffering of those denied their basic human dignity. At St. Mary's, we learned that healing isn't just about mending bodies, it's about mending broken systems, broken trust, and broken hearts. Every parent who has ever held their sick child, every person who has felt invisible in their darkest hour, every healthcare worker forced to choose between their conscience and their career, this story belongs to you. Because in the end, pain doesn't see color, suffering doesn't check social status, and love doesn't follow protocols. Remember Sarah Parker, who lost everything trying to save a life. Remember Michael Greaves, an innocent child whose death transformed his father from healer to barrier. Remember Mary and Sarah Edwards, whose lives were deemed less valuable because of who they were. Their stories remind us that every life lost to prejudice leaves a void that can never be filled. But remember, too, that redemption comes in the most unexpected moments, when a grieving doctor finds his humanity again through the daughter of the woman he once wronged, when a mother sacrificed 20 years ago saves her granddaughter's life today, when enemies become allies in the fight to save lives. To every person who has ever been told they don't belong, to every patient who has felt unseen, to every healthcare worker struggling to maintain their humanity in an inhuman system, your pain matters. Your life matters. Your story matters. Because sometimes the greatest healing happens not in operating rooms or through medical procedures, but in the moments when we choose to see each other's humanity, when we find the courage to confront our own prejudices, and when we realize that every life we touch becomes part of our own story. Let the tears you shed today water the seeds of change tomorrow. For in the end, we are all connected in this great tapestry of healing, not by our differences, but by our shared hope for a world where every life is valued, every voice is heard, and every heart finds its way home to compassion. This isn't just a hospital story. This is a human story, and it belongs to all of us. Remember, in the face of injustice, be brave enough to act. In the presence of prejudice, be strong enough to stand. In the moment of choice, be wise enough to choose love. And in the depths of despair, be human enough to hope. Because sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the lives we save, but the hearts we change along the way. This is for Sarah, for Michael, for Mary and her daughter, for Emily and Michelle, and for every soul who has ever stood at the crossroads of fear and courage, choosing to fight for what's right even when it costs them everything. Your tears are sacred, your pain is heard, your courage changes lives. And in the end, love wins, always. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe, share it with those who need to hear it, and give it a like. Your comments mean the world to us. Want to hear what happens next? Let us know in the comments below. Your support motivates us to bring more powerful stories that remind us all of our shared humanity.